Good afternoon to the guests joining from the region, and good morning or good evening for all guests virtually joining us from different parts of the world. My name is J.K. Vijayakumar, the Library Director at King Abdullah University of Science and Technology, KAUST, and I extend you all a warm welcome to KAUST Library Annual Outreach Lecture 2021. Before introducing the speaker and the topic, which will be on the transformation happening in open access publishing and scholarly communication, I take this opportunity to announce our open access publishing deals with hybrid publishers. May I have the slides, please? In 2021, we have added the Royal Society, International Society for Optics and Photonics, Cold Spring Harbor Library Plus Press, including Life Science Alliance, and Inter-Research Scientific Publisher to our read and publish deals. We also obtained deals in discounts on article processing cost with TMA and Transtech. And annual reviews, International Water Association, EDP Sciences, European Mathematical Association will be covered through Subscribe to Open program. We will also continue the agreements we already had in 2020 with American Chemical Society, Royal Society of Chemistry, American Institute of Physics, Cambridge University Press, Oxford University Press, and Association of Computing Machinery, in addition to the discount deals we have secured with MDPI and Frontiers. We are still negotiating with other publishers, including the big ones. At the same time, we have a very successful research repository operated by the library, and an accepted version of the articles published by our authors in other publishers' journals can be submitted to the repository. The library will make sure your research is accessible beyond the paywalls. So far, 2.6 million downloads from a small institution repository and its highest compliance of full text availability are remarkable. Repository users are coming from across the globe, as you can see in the slide. You can please remove the slides from the presentation. As you have noted, most big publishers are not on our list yet. We, as a single institution, face challenges in negotiating such transformative deals with big publishers. Where almost 60% of the publishing are happening. Usually such deals are negotiated at the national consortium level, and big publishers need time to work with single institutions. And this is where the experience from Carnegie Mellon University that our today's distinguished speaker Keith will be sharing today is more significant for us. With his leadership and expertise, institutional open access publishing deals are established with some big publishers at CMU. It is my honor and pleasure to introduce today's distinguished speaker, Professor Keith Webster, the Dean of University Libraries and Director of Emerging and Integrative Media Initiatives at Carnegie Mellon University. Before this, he was Vice President at Wiley Publisher, University Librarian at the University of Queensland in Australia, Victoria University in New Zealand, worked with HM Treasury London and the University of London. Keith has also held professorships at Victoria University of Wellington and City University of London. I want to thank him for accepting our invitation and sharing his experiences today, even it is in the early morning in the US. Distinguished virtual participants, thank you for joining us today. We will have time for answering a couple of questions at the end. Please type them into your comment box on our YouTube channel. My colleague Dr. Navina will help us in picking some questions for Keith to answer. My appreciation also going to the library admin team for the organizational support and KAUST audiovisual team for live telecasting this event. Please join me in welcoming Keith to deliver KAUST Library Annual Outreach Lecture 2021. And the floor is over to you, Keith.
Thank you, Vijay. Hello, everyone. As Vijay observed, it's reasonably early in the morning here. Those of you who are tracking weather might like to know it's -7 Celsius outside. I hope it's warmer wherever you are. I've got quite a packed slide deck, so if anyone would like to grab my slides either now or afterwards, there's a link and a QR code taking you to a version of the slides on our institutional repository. I have the links also on my final slide, and I did post on Twitter last night. So hopefully you will find the slides useful, and please feel free to grab them and reach out to me with any questions. We are trying the technology. Okay, there we are. So in this lecture, I'm going to try and talk about a number of themes that hopefully lead towards beginning to answer the question that Vijay posed. How does an individual institution make progress in a world that is dominated by major publishers and major library consortia? I'll start by making a few observations about some of the current or relatively recent issues in publishing as they relate to negotiations with libraries and as they relate to open access deals. I'll spend a bit of time talking about the big three commercial publishers, Elsevier, Springer Nature, and Wiley, because those three together produce more than a third of the published journal literature. And I'll say a little bit about the sorts of open access deals we have seen those publishers negotiate. I'll then turn to local action. How do we as individual librarians inside our institutions prepare to negotiate an open access deal? And finally, I'll say a few words about the work we've done at Carnegie Mellon in the last couple of years. I will make the point that what any individual institution does is not necessarily translatable to any other institution. And I'll say more about that when I get to the CMU experience. So let me begin by saying a bit about the publishing landscape. And I will start by just making some general observations. The first is now a relatively old quote, but not one that is completely out of character. And this is a perspective from somebody at Elsevier, that librarians, in short, are not very good at negotiating, and that gives publishers a particular advantage. And that, whilst maybe that has been overtaken by more recent camaraderie between publishers and libraries, it is certainly still a theme that conditions our relationships. But perhaps those relationships also are conditioned by challenges that both parties face. On the one hand, those of us in libraries, and this is data from the United States, understand that over the last 20 or more years, the price of academic journals, represented on this graph in the top line in red, vastly outstrips any other expenditure and certainly is greatly ahead of the consumer price index. And we all feel the pinch. We have cut purchasing of books, we've cut other expenditure, we've argued for budget increases simply to stand still. And at the same time, inside our institutions, we have seen library expenditure decline as a share of total university expenditure. And that is something that, again, many of us feel quite keenly. When I moved into library administration in the UK 25 years ago, typically we would expect to receive around about 4% of an institution's budget. And today, in many institutions, that is below 2%. From the publisher's perspective, the story is a little bit different. And what they point to is an increase in scholarly output over the last 25 years. And I've pulled some data from Scopus showing 3 different geographic regions: the United States, the European Union, including the UK, and China. And you can see that there is a steady upward line in each of these. And publishers point to the fact that they are publishing much more than they used to do, and they are also receiving many more submissions than was historically the case. They point also to the huge growth in output from China, and what you see here is that China's share of the world output has accelerated, and around about 2020, China was neck and neck with the United States as the individual nation with the largest output. And publishers will argue that at least some content they receive from China requires closer editing, greater editorial review than material coming from other countries, and that costs more in terms of editorial work, as well as the huge volume of submissions that they have received. So that kind of sets the stage. We've got librarians worried about budgets and prices, and publishers worried about costs as a result of increased scholarship. One point that I would make, and Vijay was kind enough to say a bit about my background, and I've been a library dean or director now in 4 countries, and one thing that I have come to appreciate is that we are operating in a global marketplace. And if I'm negotiating from the perspective of a library director in any given country, I ought to at least understand the landscape within which publishers are operating, and what might be a financial crisis in one part of the world might be a fairly optimistic period in another country. For example, during the global financial crisis around about 12 years ago, much of the world experienced a recession. Australia, where I was based at the time, did not. And that gave us a different negotiating landscape. And most publishers, as a supplementary point, tend to invoice in one of 3 major currencies: US dollars, euros, and British pounds. And if you are in a country outside those currencies, you are experiencing or exposed to currency fluctuations that might well influence your ability to do certain things with publishers. So all of that is contextual. I would also point to the the financial press. It's always worth keeping an eye on what is happening in the publishing world, what we can see from things like the library environment and the Spark big deal cancellation tracking service, but particularly what we hear about publishers from the financial press. That can often tee up, and I'll say a little bit more about that later on, an opportunity to negotiate in particular ways. But we are certainly in an environment where publishers are feeling quite squeezed. A close reading of the financial press points to that. And what we certainly see is publishers experiencing pressure. I skipped through that slide, sorry, the tracker is a little bit fiddly. Customer pressure on the one side in terms of our concerns about pricing. Most commercial publishers also are exposed to pressure from their investors, and publishers are caught in the middle of that squeeze. That has been the situation for a few years now, but the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted us all, both in individual institutions and inside publishers' houses. And you could argue that whilst distress might be an extreme way of framing the situation, publishers certainly are experiencing a number of interruptions to their business. They have seen delays in concluding license agreements because most universities and consortia went into lockdown, and it took a bit of time to resume negotiations, which in many cases were underway around about this time last year as the world entered the pandemic. Universities globally are experiencing financial pressures, loss of student tuition revenue because students have either deferred entry or been unable to travel, additional costs of preparing campuses to support social distancing, provide COVID testing, and so on. And all of that is leading to financial pressures inside universities, never mind the loss of investment and interest income. The global markets, whilst they recovered well through 2020, have pointed to some looming global economic challenges, and that certainly is making publishers sensitive to the situation. Many commercial journal publishers also have a book or textbook publishing business, and those have been under challenge for a period of time, and textbook sales certainly suffered during 2020. Looking longer ahead, the demographics of school leavers point to a decline in enrollment in higher education with long-term financial hits. Services, if we can call them that, like Sci-Hub, are challenging the IP ownership that publishers have relied upon to safeguard their business. There are also things like the credit risk of serials agents, which represent 20% of most publishers' revenue. Cost savings have already been achieved inside many publishers' houses. And open access regulations, I'll say again a bit about that in a moment, also point to challenges if we think about Plan S as an example. I would maybe call out three particular situations as worthy of teasing out a little bit. I won't do this in any detail, but point to the uncertainties post-Brexit. Most publishers operate in the UK or close to the UK and are exposed to things like the loss of freedom of movement of the workforce between continental Europe and the UK. We're beginning to see the impact of things like sales into the European Union from the UK and vice versa. Questions about long-term science funding for the British university system, and what that might mean in terms of the volume of research output, which is important, recognizing that a relatively small country like the UK generates roughly 7% of the world's scientific output as measured by volume of publications. Secondly, I would point to recent changes in the approach to scholarly publishing in China. Over the past 12 months, the Chinese government has announced a shift away from a reliance upon the impact factor as a measure of success, and instead favouring fewer but better publications and encouraging researchers to publish more content in Chinese journals rather than in Western journals. And of course, we can't ignore the impact of the pandemic on scholarly publishing. One point is that the global scientific community, both in industry and in higher education, has come together and shared everything. Data, publications, accelerated the use of preprint servers, and many say this has pointed to the success of openness, and we can't imagine going back. I've already mentioned the financial pressures brought by the pandemic. I would also point in the publishing space to the loss of conferences, certainly during much of 2020 and 2021, resulting in fewer conference publications, and many researchers also point to the impact of the pandemic on their time for research. UNESCO has been promoting open access for some time and has pointed more recently to the impact of the pandemic on open science and the importance of information sharing. And I do think this will condition many approaches to open access over the next little while. And I've already made the point about how researchers are reconsidering the ways in which they make their work available. This is an interesting study from Frontiers, which I would encourage anyone who's interested to look at. And then thirdly, I'd like just to touch on some of the things we hear about on the ground as we talk with researchers and think about institutional approaches. Firstly, I've already mentioned Plan S, that is now up and running, a recommendation that a group of funders have developed to encourage making full and immediate open access publications from research that they fund. And that inevitably has the potential to have a substantial impact on publishers' approaches. And as we talk about the big three, you will see some of that play out. The United States still seems to be thinking about its approach to open access, but I've no doubt that the new administration will be paying attention to this quite closely. As we think also about policies, we need to think about how the flow of funding for open access publishing works. You know, is it that an individual author will find the funds to pay an APC, or will their institution take care of it, for example, through the sorts of transformative agreements that Vijay described? Or will their funder pay? Will there be a multi-payer model where costs are shared? Will we see some sort of flip to open where a society publisher supports new models? One point that is increasingly coming to light is a recognition of the excess of funds in the publishing system. Essentially, if you take a notional APC of, let's say, €3,000 and multiply that by the number of articles published each year, you will see that that is considerably lower than the total revenue realized by publishers, pointing to the excess of funds that is represented by surpluses or profits. I won't spend time on this slide, it's familiar to many of you, I'm sure, but as we talk to researchers about the benefits of open access, we can point to many of these phenomena: more exposure for their work, greater citation rates, public visibility of their research rather than confining the audience to those who have access to library subscriptions. I will spend more time later in my presentation talking about my university's particular situation, but I would point here to some light touch data, but nevertheless data that points to the increased citation rates that our authors experience and the increased attention their articles receive when they publish in gold manors rather than behind a subscription paywall. It's fairly intuitive, but interesting to see the data bear that out. I'll now turn to the big three commercial publishers and just say a little bit about their situation. As I said earlier, Elsevier, Springer, Wiley, collectively with about 35% of the world's output. And when we look at the big five publishing countries, the US, China, the UK, Germany, and Japan, we can see that their share of publishing content there is closer to 50% than the global 35% that they enjoy. And we have seen each of these three publishers increase their output over the last 5 or 6 years, roughly by about a 50% increase on the situation in 2015. What is particularly striking, and I have checked with a number of colleagues in publishing houses and in universities to confirm that what the data, in this case from Dimensions, shows is indeed correct, that by the end of 2020, there had been a significant uptick on the previous year. So that certainly is an interesting point to recognize. Another interesting observation, and this is taken from data to the end of 2020, and you see that Elsevier and Springer, in terms of their percentage of output in gold or hybrid journals where somebody has paid an APC for an article to be open, has been relatively stable. A slight upward trend, but generally steady state. The real shift on this slide is from Wiley and the extent to which, through their transformative agreements that I'll illustrate momentarily, has really driven up their share of open access output. And this precedes their acquisition of Hindawi that was announced a couple of weeks ago. So I'm not going to belabor the point on the next 3 slides. You can look at these later, but partly I've teased out for your later review some comments from their annual reports, or in Springer's case, their IPO prospectus, about their attitude to open. And some of that is upbeat, some of it is more candid, and I've bolded points from their risk assessments as they file documents to the stock exchange. So Elsevier pointing that open access mandates could affect revenue from paid subscriptions. Also in these slides, I show the distribution of output by particular leading countries. So you can see that Elsevier on this slide has about 30% of China's output of publications, and that is Elsevier's biggest single market. Whereas if we look at Springer, not surprisingly, given their history, Germany and Austria are able to enjoy a bigger share from Springer than China, where it's down to 13%. And thirdly, and again, making the point that I'm not going to address these in any detail, Wiley, and again, some comments from their slide and their reports and their distribution. Here, partly driven by their acquisition about a decade ago of Blackwell, enjoying almost 12% of UK output. And in case anyone missed the news, Wiley bought Hindawi, one of the biggest open access publishers. That was announced, I think, on the 5th or 6th of January, and certainly will propel Wiley's position in the open access space. Much has been made over the last 2 or 3 years of the development of transformative agreements, and each of the big three has undertaken a number of national or institutional level transformative agreements. In Elsevier, and this is the world outside Europe, Elsevier has arrived at agreements with the Qatar National Libraries Consortium, California State University, as distinct from the University of California system, my own university, and an approach with the University of Florida. Inside Europe, they have had a number of deals, most notably with the consortium in the Netherlands and in Sweden and in Switzerland. Springer has had a slightly more distributed approach, an agreement in India, also one in Qatar, and an agreement with the California Digital Library, which negotiates agreements on behalf of the 10, I believe it is, universities that form the University of California system. And in Europe, quite a substantial number of agreements. And finally, for completeness sake, Wiley, they announced an agreement at the beginning of the year with Iowa State University. I believe that was the first transformative agreement they had negotiated in this country, because their efforts had been, until now, largely focused on working with large European consortia, and in terms of volume, most notably those in Germany and in the United Kingdom. This slide is based on data from the ESAC registry and shows the share of transformative agreements by publisher, and is the data are driven by the number of articles believed to be covered by each of the agreements deposited in the registry. And what's interesting to note is how the big three, from a relatively small space in, let's say, 2017, where they maybe had a shade over 50% of the transformative agreements, now completely dominate the landscape. And you can see how their approaches to that have been developed on this slide, where on the right-hand side, you see in that light peach color how Wiley's transformative agreements have given their output a substantial attention to open access by virtue of these national level agreements, and relatively steady output either through hybrid articles or in fully open access journals. So that is in many ways a way of setting the stage, and I now want to turn to the approach to negotiations and understanding how an individual university can arrive at a new contract. As I think about our agreements with publishers, I recognize that there are probably 4 metrics that are at play. On the one hand, of course, there is money. And am I entering an agreement trying to reduce the amount of money that I spend? Am I open to spending more to get a better agreement? Do I want to maximize return on investment to my university? Am I trying to promote openness above everything else? Or am I trying to drive up readership by maximizing access to content from that publisher for my university campus? And how each of these relates to the other is very much an institutional decision. But however we might characterize those 4 criteria, I do think that the homework that we need to undertake is very much driven by our approach to negotiation. Firstly, as we prepare to negotiate, I think it's important to do some homework on the individual publisher. And as I pointed out earlier, there's a lot of information in the financial press for those publishers that are listed on the stock exchange. there are regulatory filings either in the UK or the United States or in other countries that can provide some interesting insights and talking points. This is an excerpt from 2020 from a stock exchange filing made by Wiley to the New York Stock Exchange, where they talk about embargo periods and green open access as being their preferred approach to protecting subscription revenues. They're relatively relaxed as long as a 12-month embargo period is in force, that people will not cancel their subscriptions. But on the other hand, they see the gold open access model, where additional payments are made by authors or funders, as a way of generating incremental revenue. And believe me, these sorts of things offer fantastic talking points when your sales rep next comes to call and they're telling you about how committed they are to open access. Think about the reality of what the corporate bit of the company is saying to its investors. And there's a huge wealth of data to be discovered from these statutory documents. Having done our homework on the publisher's business, I think it's important to have a look at how we are working with what we already receive from the publisher. And as I think about our relations with the scholarly content that any publisher produces, we want to understand what our faculty, staff, and students are reading, how often, what content are we buying that is not being looked at, and are there any data points about things that they simply are not able to read. And of course, we can get much of this data from counter reports. We can use, in my previous slide, on that slide, that's from Alma. This is from LibInsight, part of the LibApps suite of products, ways of visualizing the data that we get from counter to help us understand the landscape with any individual publisher. One impact of the pandemic has been, certainly in my university and in many others, a shift of our community to off-site access rather than campus-based IP recognition systems. And that has generated a huge amount of logs through, for example, OCLC's Easy Proxy service. And there is a utility that has been developed by some researchers in France that helps us do a deeper dive into Easy Proxy logs to understand, absolutely anonymously, the nature of articles and journal titles that are being viewed by our community. And this is a tremendous way of getting insights that ordinarily are not possible. And I know of one university that is mapping that sort of data to some demographics around the seniority of students, for example, looking at the journals read by first-year students versus final-year students versus faculty, and by discipline, by connecting the Easy Proxy data to the institution's internal systems. Secondly, we want to be able to look at how our researchers are citing the journals that we provide access to through the library. And there are some very simple approaches there. In this case, I'm looking at some data from Scopus that can show a basket of publications written by members of the CMU community, and I can look at the references from those publications and begin to map the titles that have been cited against our holdings. And there I'm thinking about identifying material that maybe we don't have a subscription to and we might wish to gain access to as part of our negotiation. I should have made the point that turnaway data, that is when somebody at our institution tries to access data or publications from a particular platform, publishers love to tell us that. And If you ask, they will tell you, if they're not already doing so, which materials are not available to our community, but our community appears to be looking for. And thirdly, in terms of our relations with a publisher's content, I want to understand where my faculty are placing their articles. So we've looked in the middle of these three, the use, we're looking at what they are citing. Now I want to understand where they are publishing. Are they publishing in journals that we don't subscribe to, which might point to a need for content expansion? What are they doing in terms of their approach to open access? Who's funding their research, and does that funding have any relationship to open access mandates? And in this case, when I've been doing this sort of preparatory work, I have relied upon the Dimensions service from Digital Science, because it is the one platform that I have access to that allows me relatively easily to facet data by publisher. So here, just by way of very quick illustration, I have created a set of publications from 2011 to 2020, where at least one author is from Carnegie Mellon University. And I can facet that by publisher. So Dimensions has mapped journal titles to publishers. I will, as a side note, observe that it can be a little bit noisy and messy where individual journal titles owned by societies change publisher every few years. But by and large, this is a robust way of allowing me to look at which publishers my faculty are doing most business with. Whilst I'm on this slide, I will point to the fact that, as you can see on the right-hand side, Elsevier is our third biggest publisher. And that is important because most universities would find that Elsevier is number one because they were not so dominant for CMU authors. We were able to approach our open access negotiations from a slightly different perspective. Again, more on that in just a moment. I can look at trends over time, and I can also look at other facets, such as whether or not publications are open access or gold or green or any other color that open access might represent in this system. And I can conduct analytical views within Dimensions so that I could look, for example, at a period of time, my university, shades of open access by publisher and by research funder. It's quite a powerful tool. This is not a sales pitch, but I have found this hugely important as we enter our negotiations. And I can begin to also look at things like data by publisher, by the number of citations, by altmetric scores, and the like. And here, over the last couple of years, our major publishers and the shades of open access. And I can also see where our research is being cited. And my apologies, I'm running two versions of the slides, one on my computer and one remotely, and I was happily talking through the slides that I was advancing on my display. But here you are. Again, they are available for you to look at after the presentation. Another important point as we prepare to negotiate is to understand, firstly, what else are we spending with the publisher? And secondly, what other relationships does my university and its faculty have with a given publisher? Here's a screen grab of products from Elsevier. These are the things that they list that are relevant to the university community and the healthcare world. And you can see that it's a pretty small That big graphic represents a very small part of the total list of products that Elsevier might sell. And if we look more closely at our library databases, we might find that we are spending a lot of money with Elsevier. Often those who come from any big publisher with multiple product lines understand only your spend on journal products, and they don't necessarily have an appreciation of your institution's subscription to other bits of the business, other product lines, other flows of funds. And this can be an important part of a conversation. For example, with Elsevier, I know that we spend probably about a third as much again on these sorts of products as we do on journal licensing. We can also understand a little bit more, and again, I'm relying here on data from Dimensions to illustrate the point, how much are we spending or potentially spending on open access fees? And this is something that is actually quite difficult to figure out. And I have asked a couple of publishers and they candidly can't readily pull together the data that show how much we have spent on APCs or related funds. In our case, ultimately, we spoke to the university's finance department and they were able to give us some data about individual transactions paid by individual researchers that represented APC payments to a publisher. And these can add up to substantial numbers of dollars or pounds or euros in aggregate, even if individual transactions are relatively small. Most of the big publishers, and I particularly recognize Wiley and to an extent Elsevier here, publish journals on behalf of academic and professional societies. The typical model is that a society will license the right to publish its journals for usually a 5-year period of time, and then there will be a contract renegotiation, sometimes almost an auction, either for renewal or transfer to a new publisher. But what is important here is to understand which societies does a given publisher work with that are prominent amongst my institution, because sometimes that can be an important point of negotiation or of information. And for example, I was able to generate a list which I have anonymized of people at CMU who serve on editorial boards and societies and have other relationships with journals published by major publishing houses. That can be useful information as we talk to a publisher about the strength of relationship between our institution and their output. Many of us now are managing campus research information systems. These are profiles from the public version of our Elements system and point to members of our faculty who are serving on journal boards in some form or another. So all of that helps us build up a deep and powerful picture of our relationship with any given publisher. As I wrap up, I want to just point briefly to what we've been doing at Carnegie Mellon. We have been on an open access journey now for almost 20 years, beginning with the then Provost Mark Camlett signing the Budapest Open Access Initiative on behalf of the university, our faculty senate signing a resolution encouraging open access publishing or deposit. That was followed by the launch of our first institutional repository and the establishment of an open access APC fund. And in recent years, we have expanded our provision to support the sharing of data. And we, in 2017, launched our current institutional repository, KiltHub, which operates on the Figshare platform and serves as a comprehensive repository that provides access not only to publications, but also to theses and dissertations data sets, images, and candidly anything digital that can be stored in a repository. I know that my university and KAUST have a very strong and cordial relationship because we have considerable disciplinary overlap. We are both strong technological universities. In our case, our particular strengths are in areas like machine learning, artificial intelligence, robotics, advanced manufacturing. And those are important characteristics as we think about negotiating with publishers. Now, leading up here, particularly to thinking about Elsevier. As you can see on this visualization from Scopus, our particular strengths in terms of volume of output are in computer science and engineering. Nothing surprising there. If I was to look next door at the University of Pittsburgh, which has a very large medical school, I would see real strengths in medicine and biochemistry. Those of you who know the city will know that when I say next door, I mean literally next door. Our two campuses are intertwined, and that fosters considerable collaboration. But this is significant because our strengths are in fairly distinctive fields. And again, for those of you who don't know the university, we are customarily in the top 25, top 30 in the Times World University rankings and in the US News rankings. But when I think about a publisher like Elsevier, they have a particularly strong portfolio in the life sciences. And our strengths are in a subset of their published output. And that helped us as we began our negotiations with Elsevier by being able to point to the fact that we had a relatively limited scope of output in their portfolio. And that for both of us, as we negotiated a transformative agreement, we were approaching this from the perspective of sharing risk. They didn't want to open up a model through which we might start to publish thousands of papers per annum in Elsevier journals that were covered by an unlimited open access agreement. And equally, from my perspective, we didn't want to negotiate an open access agreement that was going to bankrupt the university because of the potential volume of output. And honestly, had we not done the homework that I set out in the preceding slides, we might not have reached the fairly pointed conversation that we had that allowed us to announce in late 2019 the first institutional agreement for Elsevier with Carnegie Mellon that took effect just over 12 months ago. That agreement was the first of what now represents 4 fairly substantial open access agreements. As I mentioned already, computer science is our dominant field in terms of volume of output, and we were part of a small group that worked very closely with the Association of Computing Machinery to develop the ACM Open Program, which allows participating institutions, and I'm pleased to see that KAUST is part of this, to make their published content where the corresponding author is affiliated with the participating institution. Everything there can be published open access. So as we stand today, we have 4 complete transformative style open access agreements. And I've been caught up in debates about whether they are read and publish or publish and read. From the perspective of my university community, what this means is that if a CMU faculty member or student or anyone else associated with the university is the corresponding author, then their work will be made available open access unless the author wishes otherwise. So Elsevier and ACM were the first 2 that took effect in January last year. In the middle of 2020, we announced an agreement with PLOS, and we have just gone live with our agreement with Cambridge University Press. And this has been a very intentional approach. we have recognized that we are on a learning journey. We're all experimenting, and we have developed 4 agreements with, firstly, a commercial publisher, secondly, a society publisher, thirdly, with a pure open access publisher, and fourthly, with a university press. And we are trying to understand the dynamics of each of these different types of agreements and the impact on author behavior. And we are continuing to negotiate with other organizations, we hope, before much longer, to be announcing at least another commercial agreement and another major society agreement. For those, watch this space, maybe invite me back in due course, and we can say more about that. But with that, I am going to hand back to the host. Again, links to my slides, and thank you for your attention. Happy to take any questions that might have emerged.
Thank you, Keith, for this very informative lecture, and you have been covering both sides of the business and bringing us the challenges in front of us going forward. So this is time for questions. We must be receiving questions from the YouTube channel. But I have one question for you to start with, if I may ask you. This is something you typically mentioned about the economics behind this. We don't want to bankrupt the institution. At the same time, we also have to look into the business model of research publishing. So always the transformative agreements about hybrid journals always talk about the cost neutrality. The expenses should match. But recently the pure gold open access publishing is increasing. Then societies and publishers are also starting gold only journals. The hybrid publishers also starting gold only journals. And recently some of the societies also started mirror journals, which is mirroring a branded journal. It's not converting into gold journal, it's another journal in gold open access. So this is actually adding more expenditure to an institution. So have you thought about, do you have any insight into that, and was that a part of your negotiation deals?
Sure. You point to probably the most substantial issue that we have to recognize with open access publishing. In the traditional subscription journal publishing model, the flow of funds was at the consumer's end of the product life cycle. And what that meant was that it was the reader, or typically the reader's institution, that paid. And that flow of money came from thousands of institutions around the world into a typical publisher's bank account. The reality is that if you shift those costs from the consumer to the producer, you are concentrating those costs in a much smaller number of institutions. Of course, most institutions have people who are publishing articles, but the world's global scholarly output is heavily concentrated in 100 or 200 leading institutions. And one thing that we need to understand, and particularly in the absence of a national consortium approach, is how do we absorb that distribution of costs as it shifts? As I signaled in my own institution, we are a very research-intensive place. We have a very high publication output volume, and we need to understand the implications of that as we shift towards a preferred open model. Until now, we have been able to vary the costs by looking at how much we had been spending on traditional readership models, and many of our agreements have been covered by non-disclosure agreements, so I don't want to talk financial details, but So far, we have been able to absorb things in a relatively cost-neutral manner. But we do need to recognize that at some point, those sorts of negotiations run out of steam, and we need to understand how we cover costs moving forward. And this is where a mixed payer model becomes more attractive. Can we look at ways in which those who fund the research can share in the costs of supporting open access alongside the institutions that employ the researchers? And the University of California has very much been at the forefront of developing these sorts of models in this transitional phase. The second point I would make there, Vijay, is that for some publishers, a substantial portion of their subscription revenues comes from non-academic institutions that publish very little, whether it's engineering companies or healthcare systems or legal practices, depending on disciplines. And a question that remains fairly unanswered is whether or not there is a mechanism through which those subscribers might somehow be incentivized to continue supporting publishing when the content that traditionally was behind a paywall is now openly available. So we are all trying to figure out how this might eventuate. We have seen in some national consortia the ability for a government-sponsored agency to try and redistribute library subscriptions to open access payments. But in a country like the United States, that is not going to be possible.
Okay, thank you. So I think you covered answering the second question came in the chat. It's like OA cost will likely increase or decrease over time, and why in terms of its size and scope. I think you answered for that. Do you have any additional comments for that?
One thing that many of us who have been looking at this for some years have anticipated is the potential emergence of a marketplace for APCs. It's not quite clear yet whether we're going to see true competition or whether there will continue to be almost a monopolistic model. If we look at Nature's recent announcement of, I think it was an $11,000 APC, it is clear that they are banking on the perceived quality of the journal as driving the amount of money that somebody will be prepared to pay for an APC. Will that continue? It's not clear. Will research funders come together and begin to try to impose some sort of payment cap on APCs? Again, that's not clear. But what certainly people are anticipating is the point that I made earlier, that if you look at the number of journal articles published per annum and the amount of money that publishers collectively receive per annum as they sell their subscriptions, the APC that you would calculate there is considerably higher than the typical APC that we see being charged at the moment. So if you were to flick the switch overnight, which of course is impossible, you would see a considerable return of funds to the university and research enterprise. The unknown or the evolutionary phase is how we get from here to that sort of future state.
Okay, thank you. So I think we are of the time. I have one more quick question, if you can take it. I think it's very relevant for now. This is about upskilling. The question is, do you think all the libraries are prepared first to do the negotiation, but importantly to manage the agreements after the negotiations are done? It needs a lot of tools and workflows. This is something new to many of the colleagues. So what is your thought about that? Probably this is our last question.
Sure. So I'll be brief. In terms of the negotiation, I've made some points about the sorts of background information and data that we need to gather. And that is important and something that really librarians are better placed than anyone to do. But I would encourage those who are new to this or feeling uncertain to reach out to experts inside their universities, whether it's somebody who works in the contracts area or in the procurement department. They can be tremendous partners in helping to understand the small print in agreements, for example. I work very closely with the director of the University Contracts Office at CMU, and whether we're talking about open access agreements or other contracts we enter into, he adds so much to the process that we would be much worse off without the director's expertise. In terms of upskilling beyond that, you point to some real issues that we need to understand. Firstly, what is the publisher's workflow and how do they support authors and the selection of open access choices? And with a number of our agreements, we have been the first or amongst the first of individual institutions working with publishers, and we together have had to work out some teething troubles. As an example, recently we had a case of an article that was submitted by a recently graduated PhD student and their advisor. The student was the corresponding author. The student had taken up a new academic position at another institution, and they had listed that institution as their home, and the article was deemed to be ineligible. That required a bit of behind the scenes negotiation to bring it back under the terms of our agreement. So author education is important. Understanding the reporting that we can expect from publishers in terms of numbers of articles is important. One publisher has raised with us the point of potentially authors gaming the system. If you have a group of authors from different institutions, will they designate as the corresponding author the one whose institution is covered by an open access agreement, even if they would not ordinarily be the corresponding author? And how does that skew the article numbers that the publisher has used to price the agreement? So lots of new bits of the business that we need to think about. And I would point to my colleagues at OA 2020, run out of the Max Planck Digital Library, who organize a number of training events to help us all understand these new systems and develop the skills, become familiar with the technologies that support new types of engagement. Next month, we're planning to do a workshop under the auspices of OA 2020 on how to generate data with which to inform open access negotiations. So please look out for these opportunities. I'm sure we will see more and more over time.
Thank you, Keith. Yeah, that's very informative, and the transformation has to happen, including in our librarian profession. So that is the key point we are taking today. Thank you very much for your time and your valuable talk and sharing your information in the morning. And we wish you a very good day ahead. And dear Vishesh, viewers, thank you for watching this outreach lecture. And on behalf of KAUST and the library, I thank everyone. And this is Vijay Kumar signing off from KAUST. Thank you very much.